Welcome to the Andy Warhol Museum. I'm Patrick Moore. I'm the director of the museum. When you come and visit us at the Warhol, we will send you to the top floor of the museum, the 7th floor. You're going to work your way around through our permanent collection and get here to the 2nd floor, where we present exhibitions that are temporary exhibitions, either looking at one part of Warhol's work or at young, emerging artists, living artists, who are working in the same vein as Andy and exploring some of the same issues that were important to Warhol. Fantasy America, which we're going to look at today, is based on Warhol's book, or responding to Warhol's book, America, and it is organized and curated by our chief curator, Jose Carlos Diaz. Fantasy America is presented by Bank of America, generously supported by Artis, Arts Equity and Education Fund, the Horace W. Goldsmith Foundation, the Fine Foundation, Sheila Riker Fine Foundation, Richard King Mellon Foundation, Joshua Hagan and Todd Cradafil, and the Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield and Allegheny Health Network. So as you can see, there's been a lot of support for Fantasy America, and as we walk around the exhibition, I think you'll see why. So, Fantasy America. As I said, 5 artists, 5 young artists, Brooklyn artists, but from many different backgrounds, living in Brooklyn, working in Brooklyn, and responding to Warhol's book, America, from 1985. So why the change in title, Fantasy America rather than America? In the book, which was published in 1985, Warhol writes about this idea of living here in Pennsylvania, growing up as a child, thinking about this big, probably glamorous, interesting world that seemed very far away from Pennsylvania, and thinking about the fantasy of America rather than the reality of our daily lives. That's what this book is about. It's a kind of moment captured in this country in the 1980s. This is a later edition, but on the first edition, it's also the Statue of Liberty. But those of you who are a little bit older might recall that in the 1980s, the Statue of Liberty was covered in scaffolding. It was being repaired. And so I think that actually that particular image of the Statue of Liberty kind of out for repairs in a moment of transition really sums up not only that moment in the 1980s, but this current moment in 2021. We're going to start today looking at the work of Nona Faustine. Nona lives in New York City, as I said, in Brooklyn. And these works are sort of images that are snatched from the current moment, where we're thinking a lot about monuments and the complicated history of monuments in our country. Many monuments that refer to the Confederacy, and also other monuments that we've increasingly felt uncomfortable with as representations of America. This is not a monument. This is a moment that many of us will remember of Donald Trump walking out of the White House with lots of protesters who were very kind of roughly dealt with, and going down with this borrowed Bible, not his own Bible, to stand in front of a church for a photo op. Nona was in her home watching television, and she was so kind of overwhelmed by this that she took a picture, literally, of the television screen. And you see America is down here in the corner, but America is just sort of barely on the screen. It's sort of getting cut off and truncated. And when you take a still photo of a television image, the bars continue to kind of be captured that would roll very quickly by, and our eyes wouldn't usually see it. So in this kind of accidental image, Nona has Trump standing with the Bible, but obliterated partly, and kind of also on fire with this red bar rolling across the screen. This image is different than the other images, because the other images, Lincoln, for example, Nona has put something to block the image in front of her camera. I think that this image is particularly kind of heartrending because Nona is an African-American woman, and the idea of the Lincoln Monument being sullied somehow or kind of lost to her as part of her own personal history is particularly poignant, I think, in this moment in time. Let's take a look at two of my other favorites here. Here we have the Teddy Roosevelt monument, formerly in front of the New York Museum of Natural History, removed after a great period of controversy. Roosevelt was flanked on his horse by a figure of an indigenous person and a figure of a black man. So again, Nona has this kind of red strike, kind of obliterating the image and calling up again, are these monuments that are holding up heroes, or are they monuments to violence? Statue of Liberty perhaps is my very favorite. This was taken on the Staten Island ferry. Nona was on the Staten Island ferry. She looked up, she saw the Statue of Liberty, and she snapped the photo, not even realizing really that this bar of the window went across the Statue of Liberty, kind of taking away its base, taking away its stability. So it's just floating in air. But again, calling into question whether these monuments really are the way that we want to represent ourselves as America. Let's take a look at another artist around the corner. Before we take a look at Nama Sabar's work, you may have noticed when we were talking about Nona's work, this incredible wallpaper behind the monument photographs that Nona has taken, the silk screens she's made from them. And this wallpaper, it's actually a Warhol artwork. There are 5 original, authentic wallpapers that Warhol designed. When he had his show at the Whitney Museum, he started thinking in the 1970s about wallpaper as a way not to just have a blank wall behind his work, but to make the wall itself into an artwork. So this is considered genuine Warhol artwork. When it comes down, it will be destroyed. We have the exclusive license to make it again. And it's particularly meaningful because, of course, it's a wallpaper of the Washington Monument, and it's juxtaposed with Nona's monuments that she's made artworks from. But moving on to Nama Sabar, who is an artist also living in Brooklyn, born in Israel. And we're going to give you in a moment a chance to look a little bit and hear a little bit Nama's work. But for right now, for the sake of audio, the sound is down. But Nama is extraordinary because she is taking a look at the difficulty, the differences between people and the difficulty in connecting between them. Nama is a queer woman, and she makes images that often relate to sound, to music, to her background as a punk musician. And in this incredible work named Stranger, which is a digital film, Nama in 2017 had this guitar, this odd double-sided guitar created. And we see here these 2 women playing the guitar or attempting to play the guitar together. And the difficulty, as I said, in terms of coming together, forming a relationship, and perhaps especially in this moment, forming a relationship in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a country that's in crisis where it seems like people can never quite come together. Nama will be coming here to the Warhol to do a performance related to this work, and I'm going to leave you for a moment to listen to the kind of audio, the harsh audio, along with the images. So enjoy Nama Sabar's work. Let's take a look at a Warhol work that is here in Fantasy America as part of the exhibition. Jose, when he organized the exhibition, worked with the artists to identify select works from our collection that the artists felt were resonant with the work that they were going to show here at the Warhol. Here we have Warhol's dance diagram from 1962, an incredibly important work in our collection, and it relates to the work of Kambui Olajimi, who I'm going to talk about now. Dance diagram, for those of you who are familiar with Warhol's work, you probably identify as a kind of key signature image from Warhol. But many people who are younger actually don't realize that in the era that Warhol was making this work, you could open up a magazine, for example, and see an ad to send away for a dance diagram that you would lay on the floor and then follow the diagram and learn the dance, in this case, the foxtrot. So Warhol, when he created these paintings, actually showed them on the floor. We have them displayed on the wall because it's a little bit safer. But these are incredible works. In the early 1960s, Warhol was, for the first time, being the first artist who would lift images out of the commercial media and transport them onto a canvas. But to the point of having them here, we have the work of Kambui Olajimi, who is a really extraordinary artist in New York City. I've had the pleasure of seeing these works in Kambui's studio, and it means so much to me to see them here now in the museum. So what's the connection between Warhol's dance diagram and Kambui's work? There was, ironically, in the 1960s, a movie called They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, which starred Jane Fonda. It was made in '69. And They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Was about what we now think of as dance marathons. They probably don't even really exist anymore, but they were a way to raise money. And these people would get out there on the dance floor and dance and dance and dance for hours on end, days on end. Kambui was watching this film, and he, as I suppose is the case with much media, was shocked that he could see nobody who was a black or a brown body, who looked like him, who was represented in this film. And although the film has a kind of brutal element to it, it also has love stories. So here we have Kambui kind of doing his own version of these images with black people, beautiful black people, different genders, different types of people coming together, dancing, holding one another, finding love and affection in their bodies instead of trauma. These were images taken in very beautiful places, for example, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, but there's a kind of undercurrent of sadness, this effort to connect, to kind of have a tenderness in a moment in a country where there's often brutality. So let's take a look at two other Kambui Olajimi works in this section of the show. This is a beautiful ink and graphite work on paper from Kambui Olajimi, and it relates to a project that's in the planning stages. You may have heard of a parabolic flight. A parabolic flight is when you go onto a plane, you go way up in the air, and then the plane dives suddenly. And for a moment or two, your body is weightless. You're floating in air as if you're in outer space. Kambui has created this work, Land's End, where we have black bodies floating, weightless, effortless, at peace. And the idea of this work for me is that there have been so many years of oppression for black people in this country that Kambui has freed these bodies from the weight of history, from the weight of American history. So whether it's in his film of this parabolic flight that we will eventually see, or here in this beautiful work, we see this idea of these bodies, African-American bodies, floating weightless and free outside of history, kind of outside of time. You know, Warhol was a pioneer. Everybody says that, but why was he a pioneer? For me, the most incredible thing about Warhol was that he worked in every media. We know he was a painter. We just looked at a Warhol painting. But Warhol was a sculptor. He was a photographer, a filmmaker, a printmaker. He drew beautifully. Warhol also managed bands. Remember the Velvet Underground? He started a magazine, Interview Magazine. He even had a television show on MTV. This was not typical for an artist of the 60s, 70s, or really even the 80s. So when we think about Warhol in that era, there's a kind of through line to so many young artists working today who embrace every media. They don't want to be constrained. That is certainly true of the work that we're going to look at now from Chloe Weiss. Here we have Chloe's work, a painting, a beautiful painting, but a painting that has two different things going on. First, there's this old master quality. It looks like Dutch 17th century painting. Then you start to notice these commercial elements, President Butterbrand down here at the bottom, but then this word catastrophique. And Chloe must have been thinking, it certainly makes me think of a certain president that we've had until very recently, who was very much of a catastrophe in our country. Chloe also here goes even further, another beautifully painted canvas, but embedded in the center of it is this sort of cheap consumer product, farmland heavy cream, something that she might have run down to the neighborhood bodega and picked up. With Chloe, she really is a creature of social media, I think. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in this embrace of her world around her. Chloe kind of rose to fame in the world of social media, fashion. If we look at some of her video work, they included a lot of models and very beautiful people. Chloe loves to joke, and she went to the fashion shows in Paris, and she had a purse that looked like it was made from a bagel, and it had these beautiful Chanel chains on it, and everyone thought it was a real Chanel product. They're like, where do I get the bagel purse? How can I get the bagel purse? She had another one made from a baguette. And although it was a joke, everybody in the fashion world was so easily drawn into it, to the extent that Chanel actually started to give her products and wanted her to incorporate them in her work, which really harks back, if you think about it, to Warhol and Campbell's Soup, Coca-Cola, all of these brands that got embedded in Warhol's work, a little bit as a joke and a little bit as a critique. I want to show you one more painting from Chloe that I really love, especially in this moment. I had to show you this beautiful but perverse painting from Chloe Weiss. Tormentedly Untainted is the title of it. And it seems to be something that Chloe must have produced during the COVID crisis in quarantine, when we're all so desperate to be with one another. But we have to mitigate that with rubber gloves and Purell. But no, this painting was all the way back in 2019, long before we knew about COVID. And Chloe has this gentleman in the center, probably one of her model friends, and it really is an advertisement that seems to have sort of gone wrong. It's all about this yearning and desire. Here's this young hunk in his iridescent shirt, the height of fashion, and these female hands reaching towards him. But there's something really rather threatening and isolating about these hands. The hands over here on this woman are almost talon-like, with these blue fingernails that are so sharp and pointed. And then, of course, this hand, this monumental hand coming around on the other side, is sheathed in plastic or in rubber. So we have, as always in Chloe's work, a kind of the moment feeling, but I think that this is a more universal idea rather than just being about quarantine and COVID. It's more about our inability sometimes, even the most beautiful people have an inability to connect and really touch one another and have a kind of emotional feeling for one another that they might want. So although we feel very much that we're in quarantine mode here, I think Chloe's talking about some universal issues in our country. The last of our 5 artists in Fantasy America is Pacifico Solano, and I'm particularly drawn to Pacifico's work as a gay man who lived in New York City in the 80s and 90s at the height of the AIDS crisis. Pacifico, although he's quite young, looks back to that era with a kind of fascination, and he creates work that is about desire, sexuality, loss, nostalgia. And we've paired Pacifico's work here with Warhol's fantastic silkscreens of Dennis Hopper. If you come to visit us here at the Warhol, you're going to see throughout the museum examples of Warhol gazing at these sort of Hollywood stars, these really butch guys, whether it's Dennis in his cowboy outfit, we have Marlon Brando upstairs in his beautiful white t-shirt, Elvis, all of these symbols of American masculinity that could not have been further apart from Warhol, but that he still desired and could look at and kind of have that male gaze through the mediation of a canvas. Pacifico's work, quite different than that, not as direct. In this work called The Meat Rack, for example, Pacifico has taken an image from Fire Island's famous area called the Meat Rack, where gay men gather on the island to meet one another, to connect, and to have sex out in the open. But Pacifico has abstracted the image to the extent that we only have a kind of whisper of that sexuality that lays underneath these images. Pacifico uses this technique really evocatively in this work over here on the wall. Pacifico had a very direct reason that connected him to this history of gay men in America. He had an uncle who had died from AIDS, and it was as if he was erased from the family history. His family never spoke about him. Pacifico was fascinated by this gay uncle that he never got to meet, and he was also kind of drawn to these images from porn magazines of the same era, from when his uncle would have been living his life in New York City. So we see just glimpses here of sexuality. We see a man's arm, legs, a man down here in these red shorts, very provocative red shorts, but mostly we also see nature. This work, extraordinarily, was deemed too provocative by the city of Miami Beach when it was going to be shown there, and they only really wanted to show sort of the sparkling water or the woods, taking away the meaning of it. So we certainly didn't want to, and Pacifico didn't want to not only have had an uncle that was disappeared, but to have his artwork also kind of sanitized in that way. Much of the work that you've seen in Fantasy America today seems very much of the moment. You might think that these young artists living in New York City were responding to the Black Lives Matter movement or to the COVID crisis. But the reality is that most of the work that you've seen today was created before either of those movements or that crisis of the COVID crisis. This is work that these artists have been engaged in many years. These are artists who are thinking about their time and on a continual basis questioning us, making us think about our society, our role in society, much as Andy Warhol was helping us to think about America in 1985, which was also a complex time. So while this seems very much of the moment, we invite you to come here to the Warhol because in each moment, at each different period in our history, we can question America without being apart from America. That's what Warhol was doing. He was drawn to our culture, but he also stepped back from it and looked at it. So we invite you to come and visit us at the Andy Warhol Museum to see the work of emerging artists who are important to our society and also to see our incredible permanent collection. We'll see you soon.